Today's interview is with Anthony Katsur, CEO of the IAB Tech Lab. I have been casually aware of the IAB, that's the Internet Advertising Bureau, for quite some time. When I first started doing things on the web and when those things involved advertising, I somehow knew that the standard sizes of what was this size of ad or that size of ad was defined by the IAB. So I knew them for that ad size standard. And when I started doing research for our ad tech season, this organization that had just been there in the background for me personally all this time was something I had to look up. And standards would be the right word if you've got to choose one to sum up the IAB. Our conversation today gets into how that works, and specifically the RTB protocol for real-time bidding and the VAS standard for video ad serving. All that and more coming right up.
My name's Tony Katsur. I'm the CEO of the IAB Tech Lab. I would say that's the only affiliation I would share.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about IAB and specifically the IAB Tech Lab?
The IAB Tech Lab was spun out of the IAB in March of 2014. The IAB Tech Lab is the global technical standard setting body for digital advertising around the world. So we steward protocols like the RTB, or the real-time bidding protocol, the video ad serving template, also known as VAST. We work closely with other IABs, in this case, IAB Europe, on the TCF, or the Transparency and Consent Framework. So that's a sample of some of our work. We have our own governance, our own bylaws, our own board. And our role is to ensure that technical specifications or technical standards and open source projects that support the digital advertising ecosystem are stewarded by an independent trade organization to create interoperability amongst the digital advertising ecosystem, to support areas of consumer privacy, balance against addressability, and to ensure that there are things like cross-channel measurement standards from a technical perspective. That's an example of some of the work that IAB Tech Lab does.
And then the standards, I could make up a standard with my friends and we could share it amongst ourselves, but I don't imagine it's going to take off. Why do the IAB standards stick so well and people follow them?
Tech Lab standards are developed through our working group. So we oversee approximately 22 working groups if you include some of the sub-working groups that we also manage. So for example, the RTB protocol and iterations of the real-time bidding protocol are iterated upon through a working group process. And that working group is public and open to all of our membership. There's a lot of consensus building and a lot of input by members of the community into the actual standards themselves. You're in some ways kind of pre-adopting the standards by joining the Tech Lab and helping develop those technical specifications in a working group environment. So when those standards are launched to the ecosystem, more often than not, they've already been somewhat evangelized throughout the industry through the working group process. And therefore that speeds adoption throughout the ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean everything that we develop as a standard is always adopted. I think a good example is if you look at VAST 4, most of the industry is still on a variation of VAST 2.x. VAST 4 has not been as widely adopted as we would like. Our standards are adopted based on merit and utility. We're not the internet police. We can't force people to adopt our standards. So there have been standards or technical frameworks that have better adoption than others, RTB being one, VAST 2.x being another. Some of our rich media technical standards are also very well adopted.
And for these standards, could they come off, if I read through everything, as best practices, or are these more like formal software contracts?
I think it's a combination of best practices and required data fields, if you will. There are components of the RTB protocol that if you don't leverage parts of it, it just won't work. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a contract, but you need to have a baseline. You need to use at least a baseline of a technical specification in order for it to function in our ecosystem. So there is a best practices element to all the standards that we publish. And then there are just some core components where the specification won't function unless you use some of the core components.
And if I were interested in real-time bidding, maybe I wanted to go out and participate in some of those, I guess it would be supply side. I want to get the supply. I'm on the demand side. What do I need to do to be compliant with the standard?
Download and read the specification and examine what are the core components that are needed for the RTB protocol to function in a way by which you can effectively trade media. In order to quote unquote comply with the standard doesn't necessarily mean you have to use every single component of the standard. You just need to use the core components that are required for it to actually be functional.
And assuming I'm at a bigger company where there's a lot of different roles, is that something a product manager or like a lead engineer should be going through?
Likely the lead engineer is much more closer to the actual technical standards. I think it's important for product to understand those and look for features and functionality in newer versions of the standard that may support their business needs. But really, it's incumbent upon the engineering team to have a deep understanding of the technical standards.
And could you describe something about the feedback process? Like with real-time bidding, it must be that there are people out there in field with these ideas deployed, and then maybe there's certain cases, corner cases that need improvements or something like that. How do iterations take place?
That happens again through the working group process. So when we release a version of RTB, the latest version is RTB 2.6. Anything that's discovered in the field in terms of new use cases, or maybe the current version of the protocol doesn't quite satisfy a use case as intended, that is all brought back to the working groups. And the working groups are always working. When we released RTB 2.6, the working group immediately turned to the next version of RTB, which we're going through the planning stages on now. And those working groups are, those can be as big as 250 people. Not 250 people join at a time. On average, it's somewhere between 20 and 40, maybe 20 to 50 folks join a working group call. And those working group calls are typically held fortnightly or biweekly. That's where things are proposed formally to be introduced into a next iteration of the spec. And that process, again, is entirely public. It is documented and published. Once a month, we publish all the activities of our working groups to our membership. It is then debated and deliberated as to what features make it into a future version of a specification versus what is not a priority. And then we go into the design phase of exactly how something may be implemented in one of our technical specifications. But it's all done through the working group process, which is comprised of our members. So think of the working groups as tables, and the ecosystem has multiple seats at those tables to determine what goes into future versions of our specs.
From the perspective of history, real-time bidding's pretty new, but it's been around for several years now, and I imagine has gotten to some point of maturity. Maybe controversy is too strong of a word, but I guess what kind of controversy or topics come up that you need to address?
Specific to RTB or overall technical specification for the ecosystem?
Well, both, really.
I think with RTB, controversy within RTB, I don't know if there's controversy within the protocol itself. I think challenges that we face as an industry are in the areas of consumer privacy balanced against the addressable nature of the internet and digital advertising across the internet. I'd say that's probably the number one challenge the industry faces today, is how do you find that balance between ensuring consumer privacy and data security in an ecosystem that is inherently addressable, whose growth has been driven by its addressability, the ability for advertisers to more surgically target consumers with goods and services is one of the things that really led to the growth of the internet over the past 20 years. So I think the challenge that we face as an industry is finding the right balance between ensuring consumer privacy and data security while also maintaining an addressable digital advertising ecosystem that subsidizes really all the content we consume, all the digital services we use, all the investigative journalism that we use to educate ourselves as citizens. That's all ad subsidized. And it's ad subsidized because digital advertising is highly precise, and it works. It performs. So that's why ad dollars have flowed into the internet like they have over the past 2 decades.
So you'd mentioned privacy being one of the main concerns. Could you elaborate a little bit on the ways in which you're addressing privacy through standards?
So if based on different jurisdictions, there are different regulatory frameworks that require different forms of privacy compliance. One example would be the General Data Protection Act in Europe, known as GDPR. That requires notice and active consent by consumers before you can leverage their data in the digital advertising ecosystem. IAB Tech Lab partnered with IAB Europe on the Transparency and Consent Framework, better known as TCF, in order to manage that process and ensure that that consent level signaling flowed throughout the digital advertising ecosystem in the European market. We also recently introduced the Global Privacy Platform. This was 2 weeks ago into the industry. The Global Privacy Platform is intended to ensure that consent is gained across jurisdictions and that consent signaling is distributed throughout the digital advertising ecosystem to ensure that media companies, ad technology providers, advertisers are in compliance with local jurisdictional consent and privacy regulation throughout the ecosystem. What does that mean in more practical terms? Let's say you are a citizen of the state of California and you are subject to CCPA. Next year, you'll be subject to CPRA for consumer privacy purposes, and you are on vacation in Italy and you open up a public, you go to a website to get your morning news as you're enjoying your espresso in Italy. You need to be compliant from a consent perspective, both in Europe in accordance with GDPR, as well as within California, according to CCPA. Again, it'll be CPRA next year. If you're out of compliance in either one of those jurisdictions, you are subject to rather material damages to your business. The Global Privacy Platform is designed to ensure that those consent signals are carried across those jurisdictions to you, the publisher, to ensure that you actually have consent flags from a California resident that is vacationing in Europe, and to ensure that you are compliant with two different jurisdictional regulations at the same time. Those are two examples between the TCF and the Global Privacy Platform. Those are two examples of things that Tech Lab is working on within the realm of privacy.
Well, not that I want to test it, but what's the consequence for ignoring that?
In Europe, GDPR, I believe the fine goes as high as, I want to say it's $20 million or $80 million. I can't quite recall, but it's a material fine.
Bigger than my budget, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a significant fine. It's either a percentage of your overall top line, but I do believe it's capped at a higher end, and I just don't recall off the top of my head what the cap is at this moment.
So I definitely want to, take all consumer rights into account, and I want my website to be compliant and all that kind of stuff, but it is getting a bit complicated, not just because there's lots of rules to follow, but as you mentioned, we may develop different standards in different places. Is this getting too hard for the average person to do?
It is getting more difficult. It's going to get more complicated before it gets easier, as we see more data protection authorities or data protection-like authorities spring up across the globe, as we see more regulations pop up also across the globe. But even just here in the U.S., there are currently 5 states that have passed privacy legislation in 2022, or in some cases enhanced or evolved their privacy legislation, like California. That we're going to see even more states in the future enact and pass additional privacy laws, which will just make this ability to comply with privacy regulations difficult for mid to small size media companies. And what we're working on at Tech Lab is, how do we establish a framework to make it as simple and as easy as possible for these, really, for the entire ecosystem. But my biggest concern is really these small to mid-sized publishers just not having the systems in place, or really the resources in place, in order to ensure compliance. You've got privacy laws now in the books in California, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, and Connecticut. So those are 5 states, and probably going into next year, there's going to be anywhere from 5 to 8 more states that are going to pass privacy laws. When you throw the existing privacy regulations in GDPR in Europe, Brazil has also stood up a data protection authority. And then there are other markets like Japan, Australia, early days in India, where there's also data privacy acts or some form of consumer data protection being proposed in their various, in the halls of their governments around the world. This becomes a patchwork of notice, consent, and privacy compliance. Our work is cut out for us in terms of evolving the frameworks we've developed, and even establishing new frameworks as needed.
Yeah, there's so many technologies out there and organizations. I mean, a website seems like a website, but behind the scenes, it can be so many different things. I imagine that poses some challenges for that framework you were describing. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the effort to develop a tool to help organizations follow all the standards?
We don't necessarily offer a tool, so to speak. Our standards typically are released with reference implementations
Hmm.
to make it easier for organizations to adopt our standards. And our reference implementations incorporate best practices in terms of how things are deployed. So there's not necessarily a tool per se yet. We are looking at maybe potentially some open source projects in the areas of tools to maybe ease deployment of some of these privacy frameworks, but we haven't arrived at really any specific solution in terms of privacy compliance frameworks. We haven't developed a specific tool to deploy those. It's really about referring to our technical standards and using the reference implementations to deploy that across your infrastructure.
And where do you see these techniques being maybe 5 years out? It seems like we're going through perhaps a time of transition. Are we going to land somewhere or just keep evolving?
I think we're going to keep evolving for a while. I think we're very early in the world of consumer privacy in this ecosystem. I think things like privacy enhancing technologies, which we're working on, I think those are going to yield some very compelling solutions for the market. What I like about privacy enhancing technologies is its ability to de-identify and encrypt a consumer. So it becomes very difficult to reverse engineer any sort of token back to any sort of sensitive personal information. So I do think PETs, the acronym for privacy enhancing technologies, PETs for short, I do think PETs really become more of a solution in the industry over the next several years. I think the compliance frameworks that we're developing are only going to get more robust as complexity increases, just basically as more jurisdictions, whether they be state level jurisdictions, country or regional jurisdictional regulations, come to market. I think the compliance frameworks will become more complex while becoming more robust in order to streamline cross-jurisdictional privacy compliance. So I think a combination of Tech Lab framework, privacy frameworks, as well as Tech Lab work in the area of privacy enhancing technologies, I think become very valuable, practical solutions in the areas of consumer privacy and data security over the next several years.
Well, privacy enhancing technologies are super interesting to me. I've heard about kind of advanced R&D stuff like homomorphic encryption and some simpler things like where maybe instead of giving you a unique ID, you give somebody a vector of, a couple of values that describe me in some way. Could you expand a bit on the types of solutions the lab is interested in?
So yeah, we're currently focused on three specific PETs at the moment as we finalize the advertising use cases that we're considering. We're deeply interested in secure multi-party compute as one solution. That coupled with differential privacy, we think is a good foundation to maintaining some form of addressability in digital advertising while ensuring consumer privacy and data security. And then a third solution we're looking at, I think once we have heavy air quotes solved for SMPC and differential privacy, I think the third thing that we're going to look at some point in 2023 will be on-device compute. So I think those three things coupled together could make for a very compelling privacy-centric addressable advertising ecosystem in the future.
With regard to privacy, I feel like everyone, at least in spirit, says we want to preserve privacy and, give all internet users some sense of privacy and these sorts of things. But we really don't want full anonymity on the internet. I mean, we could have that today, but it would kind of ruin a lot of the experience, in my opinion. There's going to be ads on the internet, and if they're not in any way targeted, if I'm fully anonymous, I'm going to see random stuff that has nothing to do with me. So while I might not want creepy ads, I want a certain amount of targeting. Could you share your thoughts on how we meet in the middle?
I think that's a spot on observation. As I've been speaking with folks across the industry, as I've spoken with regulators across the globe, I think you hit the nail on the head. Advertising's not going away. It's not that advertising is going to disappear off the internet. And I think if we're going to get advertising, consumers at the very least want it to be relevant or somewhat relevant to them. striking that balance between maintaining someone's privacy while also having enough data in an anonymized fashion, I think is absolutely critical to delivering relevant messaging, relevant advertising messaging to a consumer. And it works. I mean, I think there's 25 years of proof that it actually works. Striking that balance is really the tricky part. But advertising is not going anywhere. I don't know if things like one-to-one advertising is the answer. And I think that's where some people get sensitive around explicit information around themselves. But at the very least, cohorts, lookalike models, those are models that have worked in the past and they'll work in the future. And I think the advertising experience without any sort of real addressability, it's not even about just relevant ads. I mean, how do you manage frequency capping? How do you not see the same ad, 30 times in a 1-hour session? That's not healthy either. That's not good for the brand and it's not good for the consumer. I think in the early days of CTV, you would sit down to watch something on CTV and you get the same ad for an entire 30-minute program. That's not a great experience either. So I think things like, it's not just about ad relevance. It's about frequency capping, reach management, investment planning. How do you actually then run attribution models to ensure that you as an advertiser are putting your budgets to the right partners that are driving whatever outcome you're seeking to drive? So it's everything from negative impact to the advertiser to certainly negative impact on the consumer, because advertising is not going away. It's just you want it to be relevant. You don't want to get necessarily brand burnout or see the same brand multiple times in a very short amount of time. There is a certain underpinning of data that's required to have a good consumer experience around advertising.
I think everyone would agree with your point about frequency. We don't want to see the same ad, 1,000 times in 30 minutes. Is that then the responsibility of, the advertiser and how they engage with real-time bidding? Or is it the responsibility of the platform to balance that? Or who should really help consumers not have that bad experience?
Well, it does still start with the data. It starts with some form of signaling that I know an individual has seen an ad 3 times today, and we don't want to exhaust them with our messaging. So 3 times that day was enough, or maybe it's 3 times that hour, maybe it's 3 times that week, depending on the advertiser. I think it's the responsibility of really all of those players that you mentioned. But I would say the onus really falls, again, if the data is there to support it, the onus for responsible frequency management really falls on the buyer, the advertiser through the agency into the DSP. They're effectively the ones that control how you're going to frequency cap ads against a consumer.
Well, I'd love to also touch on video specifically. You'd mentioned VAST, the video ad serving template. Could you expand a little bit on what that project is?
The VAST standard is a framework by which all the variables within a video ad call is passed to an ad server for decisioning. Video advertising is much more complex than display advertising. So the variables that get passed, everything from player size to information around the video or the ad breaks within the video itself, that all lives within the actual VAST standard. It's a much more complex call than just a simple display ad call. The current version we have out right now, which was released for public comment last month in September, actually, is VAST 4.3. That has a lot of improvements around it, specifically targeted for CTV. So we encourage any CTV companies that are listening to this to head to IABTechLab.com and take a look at the VAST 4.3 standard.
Could you expand a little bit more on CTV? I'm not sure every listener will know the acronym or necessarily have one in their house.
Sure. So CTV is connected TV, short for connected TV. And it's really any television or device that distributes TV content or can parse TV content that's connected to the internet.
And are we likely to see a more specialization arise in that way? I feel like, if anything, my TV's become dumber over the years. I'm just plugging things into it.
I think the television manufacturers are certainly well positioned to become more of a player in the television ecosystem from an advertising perspective. TVs are becoming incredibly robust when it comes to things like their onboard memory cache, their chipsets. These are becoming, effectively incredibly powerful home PCs with very, very large screens. So if anything, I think you're going to see the television advertising experience evolve over the next decade as connected televisions become smarter, faster, as their caching layers become more robust. I think you're going to see potentially the television advertising landscape change.
In terms of trend, could you talk a little bit about where we're going with video? I mean, I'm watching more and more on my computer, but I'm just one anecdote. What are most people doing?
Sure, I think the future of video and I think the future of television over a very long trajectory is going to be streamed. It's going to largely be delivered by the IP protocol. I think it's streaming over TCP/IP is the future of TV. Now, again, that's on a very long timeline. There are many in digital that love to shout the demise of legacy television at a regular cadence. They couldn't be more wrong. Linear television maintains a massively scaled audience. It works incredibly well for large, very large live events. I do question the internet's ability today, if everyone suddenly wanted to stream the Super Bowl simultaneously, if there's anything that could handle that today. But if you look at legacy television, whether it be QAM-based cable and satellite and over-the-air broadcast, it handles it just fine. So linear television isn't going anywhere, but I do think it's going to evolve with the advent of connected television, or CTV for short. CTV provides you the same kind of level of surgical precision from an ad targeting perspective and an attribution perspective as the rest of the digital ecosystem. And I believe advertisers have now had a taste of that within CTV, and they want that out of their linear partners. And so I do think linear is going to need to evolve to become more CTV-like. And we call that at IAB Tech Lab advanced television. It doesn't necessarily mean the delivery mechanisms of the content you take into your home changes. It could be over your legacy cable provider. It could be streamed over, your CTV app, or you could be casting it from a device to your connected television app. But I do think there's a role here. I think it's a big role for Tech Lab to play in the world of advanced television to ensure that there is data interoperability across TV environments. There's universal reconciliation across TV environments. There's the ability that data interoperability supports things like universal frequency capping across television environments. I think there's a place for Tech Lab to play here to combat fraud in these addressable or advanced TV environments. I mean, fraud has historically been a significant problem in digital advertising. And I think it's even has potential to be more of a problem in advanced TV because those are the richest unit economics and the biggest budgets are in television. And fraudsters know that. And if you look at fraud, just follow the money over the past 15 years. It went from display to mobile to digital video, and it will come to advanced television. It already is in advanced television. So I think the ability for us to create technical standards to combat that in advanced television are all key areas where Tech Lab can play. And we've got a rather significant advanced TV initiative stood up within Tech Lab right now, and we hope to be making some big announcements around that later this year.
Well, in text ads and in display ads as well, there's an important metric that a lot of people use. It's the click-through rate, or CTR, which can be informative to tell me, hey, I haven't targeted this very well. I need to go retinker. Can I get something equivalent in CTV? Could maybe the 30-second ahead button be an indicator? Although at the same time, I don't know, maybe that's a privacy concern. Is there a feedback loop that I can use to optimize my ad delivery?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think before you get to the feedback loop, it really comes down to the desired outcome of the advertiser. Historically, television has been a massive reach play. It really is top of the funnel advertising where you generate, you cast a very, very wide net to create awareness of a product or service. I think the future of television is going to be somewhat influenced by outcome-based advertising. And I don't think it's not a CTR or a cost per acquisition, but I think using perhaps other channels as proxy metrics to outcomes. So for example, if I run a spot in a certain geo at a certain time, you can start to look at search lift Did search terms against my brand go up in pick a DMA? I advertised in that DMA. Did I see a certain amount of search lift? So those kind of outcomes is just an example of what advertisers are starting to look at in the form of outcome-based advertising in television. And we're very much early days of outcome-based advertising for TV. So this is still being somewhat defined, but that's one example of an outcome-based television advertising campaign that I think we'll look at in the future. But it won't be the old metrics of CTR or CP. I don't think that's a good use of television. Excuse me.
So with VAST in place, you're getting all of this extra metadata about the video ad opportunity. Could you expand a little bit on how people take use of that? How might something like the player size or any of those other details influence the action that's going to happen next?
Sure. So VAST is based on an XML structure, and those variables are passed to the ad server for decisioning around. It could be anything from player size. It could be, all the media player details are typically passed. So, in terms of how an ad server would make a decision on that, you want to make sure you're responding with the proper ad creative that fits within the actual player size itself. Or if you are passing, various different creative elements, layered creative elements, if you're doing something like icons or, icon bugs within the actual video itself, the positioning of those bugs and where those would be placed, that's all passed. That's an example of something else that's passed within the actual VAST standard. But effectively what it is it's basically an XML schema that provides metadata for any sort of in-stream video and audio, by the way. VAST is also used for all forms of audio advertising, so whether that be podcasting or live streamed audio. But yeah, that's just one example of how you would use the VAST standard to ensure you're actually responding with the proper ad creative format that fits with the player or the player size or the player resolution that was sent in the actual VAST call itself.
Well, good standards have to emerge from a committee of many voices, and IAB Tech Lab certainly has that in place. Could you talk a little bit about the process of getting involved? If there's, I don't know, if it's for an individual contributor or a company or an NGO, what kind of people get involved and what does it take?
So Tech Lab is largely comprised of product, technology, and operational leaders at various levels in their organization. So it consists of product managers, SVPs of product, chief product officers, CTOs, SVPs of engineering, data scientists, chief architects, ad ops folks. That's the bulk of Tech Lab membership. Even at our board level, our board is heavily comprised of chief product, CTO, SVP product, SVP engineering is the bulk of our board. I have a very technical, very engaged. I'm very fortunate for the board I have at IAB Tech Lab. It's a very engaged group of board members. How people would get involved in Tech Lab is you can sign up directly. Go to IAB Tech Lab and click on membership, and you can sign up directly with IAB Tech Lab. If you're an international organization, if you're based in the US, if you are an IAB US member, you are automatically granted membership to Tech Lab if you're an IAB US member based here in the States. And then whenever anyone joins the Tech Lab as a general member, you can then join any of the working groups that are relevant to you and your company. So whether that's one of our privacy-related working groups like the Global Privacy Working Group, or that's our addressability working group, you can join that, or whether it's the supply chain working group, which works on RTB, or the VAST working group, which works on VAST, you can join any one of the working groups. You can join multiple working groups at your discretion. We don't limit the number of working groups a member company can join.
And I'm wondering if you would be willing to speculate a little bit about the future. Do you see any new working groups? Is something like the metaverse going to become of interest, or what's sort of coming down the pipe for you?
That's a good question, particularly on the metaverse. So we launched the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Working Group in February of this year. So that is a new working group. And we remain very bullish on the future of pets in the digital advertising ecosystem. In terms of future working groups, we've had some folks ask about Web3 and metaverse-related working groups. Here's the thing, because a lot of our standards live typically at the protocol level. What's nice is what we found are things like metaverse and Web3. those still work on the foundational components upon which the internet is built. And that's where a lot of our standards play. So we haven't found the need yet for a new working group at Tech Lab for Metaverse or Web3. That's not to say we may not come across that at any point, but in speaking with myriad Metaverse and Web3 companies inquiring about Tech Lab standards and how it applies to them, we've yet to come across an example where our existing standards did not work in those environments. But that's not to, never say never. We may come across something in the future that requires us to stand up a working group specific to that. And again, our working groups purely are of technical nature. Tech Lab we're not the internet police. We don't get involved in matters of public policy. Our job is to interpret public policy and local regulations to ensure our frameworks support either audit or compliance or reconciliation against public policy and regulations. But we don't enter public policy debates. That's not Tech Lab's remit. So, never would there ever be a working group within Tech Lab where we would do public interpretations of policy in order to have a point of view on it. Our job is to enact technical frameworks to support those regulations, to make sure that people fall into compliance with those regulations. So in terms of future Tech Lab working groups, it's hard to say. I don't see anything in the immediate future in terms of what new working groups we would stand up outside of the privacy enhancing technology working group that we stood up earlier this year.
Well, can you tell us where to go online to find more information?
Sure. So if you go to iabtechlab.com, all the information hangs off the menu along the top. If you want to learn about our working groups, membership, our compliance programs against our standards, we do have certification against several of our standards. Our open measurement SDK we certify against. We certify for data transparency. We have a whole podcast measurement compliance program. And if you want to learn more about our standards or go into our tools portal to download some of our tools, those are all at iabtechlab.com.
And where can people follow you in particular?
You can follow me at IAB Tech Lab. You can follow me on Twitter under @Anthony Katsur or LinkedIn. I'm active on both of those channels.
Great. Well, we'll have links in the show notes for listeners to follow up.
Great. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this installment of Data Skeptic Ad Tech. Here's a quick preview of what I got for you coming up next.
And actually, I don't know myself what harm I'm exposing myself to. It's very abstract. It's somewhere in the future. Very hard to know.
That's next time on Data Skeptic Ad Tech.